Hi everyone, it's that time again. It's coffee and chat time on a Friday. I haven't got a coffee and I've failed to pick up a water because I've moved from one desk to another this morning. But I'm really pleased to say that we have two people with us today. Our very own Caroline, who is the head of our endpoint assessment organisation, and Holly, who is on a degree apprenticeship at the moment, and they're both here to have a chat with us about the new way of working with regards to apprenticeships. Holly doesn't know that it's a new way of working because it's the only way as far as she's concerned, but it is a new way of working. And I thought it would probably be a good idea to really start off by asking Caroline if she'd open up and just explain what this new process is. And the reason I say that is because the number of employers that we've been talking to as an endpoint assessment organisation who are going, nope, sorry, what's one of those? So rather than, going all around the bushes, let's just start with a bit of an unusual start to a coffee and chat and ask Caroline to just give us an introduction on what it is. Over to you, Kaz.
Thank you. So apprenticeships have been around for almost 500 years now, and especially over the last 5 years, we've seen the new apprenticeship reforms come in. So in October 2013, the government announced that the old apprenticeship frameworks were going and the new Trailblazer standards would be coming in. So in 2015, you start to see that the reforms kicked in, and employers were then in the driving seat. They are writing the new apprenticeship standards. They're writing something called endpoint assessment plans. And we actually saw the whole field of apprenticeships completely change. Now, what that meant as part of the reforms is they brought in something called endpoint assessment organisations, and that's what ELS is. So we applied to become an endpoint assessment organisation at the end of last year, early this year, and we were approved back in March. So we were really proud to have that achievement. And so if I start by saying, well, what is endpoint assessment? It's kind of like what it says on the tin. It's the assessment that comes at the end of the apprenticeship journey, and endpoint assessment is made up of a number of assessment methods. So after the apprentice has been on their program for a minimum of a year and a day, and you would hear somebody referred to that as on program or in training. They then come to something called a gateway with their employer, and their employer will sit down with the apprentice and training provider and look at the requirements of the apprenticeship and make sure the apprentice has met all those requirements and their competence, and then they will then refer them to an endpoint assessment organisation. Again, that's where ELS steps in. So
Caroline, is the on-program piece, so I think we've got a 5-stage process according to what you've just said. Is the on-program piece got both a training piece and a work piece now before the apprentice gets to gateway?
Yes, so when an apprentice enrolls, now don't forget an apprentice can be a young apprentice, so it could be somebody leaving school, they could be 16 to 18, they could be any age. So there doesn't have to be someone who's just left school. It can be, an apprentice can be anybody who's even worked for an organisation for many years. And when they enroll on their apprenticeship program, they will undergo learning activities, training activities, off-the-job training, which needs to be 20% of off-the-job training, and they would be doing their job alongside all of this. So during their on-program time, which could be 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, depending on the standard, because apprenticeship standards are all completely different. They would be undergoing all of that throughout that time with their training provider. And during that time, the training provider will be carrying out some formative assessment, observations and things like that to make sure the apprentice is on track. Then they come to their gateway, and the gateway and they're part of the process is where they literally are reviewing their competence. They shouldn't be put forward for endpoint assessment unless all of the requirements have been met and the employer is content they've met every area, that they're competent in every area. There may also be some prerequisites. For example, as part of the apprenticeship standards, they may have to achieve their functional skills or maths at level 2. They may need to achieve at English level 2. They may also need to achieve a workplace qualification, for example, maybe a forklift driver license or something like that, again, depending on the standard. And then once all of those things have been checked and discussed and the employer and training provider are happy, they complete something called a declaration. And then that would then come through to ELS, and we would plan in those assessment activities with them for the endpoint assessment. The ideal situation is as soon as an apprentice is enrolled on their apprenticeship, the employer selects their endpoint assessment organisation very early on, because what we will do then is we will provide the apprentice and employer with the support materials they need to help the apprentice prepare for their gateway and endpoint assessment. Now,
is this what we're seeing at the moment on the screen?
This is just an example. So this is an example of the team leader apprenticeship standard. This particular standard actually has two endpoint assessments, methods of endpoint assessment now, because you've got the old standard or the old endpoint assessment plan that changed on the, I think it was the 25th of June, July, and then you've got a new plan, the endpoint assessment plan that's come in. So when people go to our webpage or talk to us, we will double check the registration dates, because depending on when they were registered, that then depends on what endpoint assessment plan they need to follow. But part of ELS's service is we will be giving apprentices, or we do give apprentices, the guides. It gives you the full pathway that you can see there, or the endpoint assessment journey. So for example, this one, I can't see it very well on my screen, but the learner will have to produce a portfolio of evidence. They need to do a presentation, and we give this guidance to every single apprentice. And like I said, everyone will be different.
Okay, so often it's quite common now, isn't it? Actually, I'm going to pause this for a nanosecond, because I didn't say this at the very beginning, and I'm really sorry for those of you that are listening in. If you've got any questions at all, just pop them in the chat function. I'll pick them up and I'll push them over to Holly and indeed Caroline. But Caroline, let me just check. It's quite common these days in schools for students to know exactly what is expected of them in the exam, how they're going to be examined, what the length of this exam, that working with the end in mind is quite a common way of delivering education these days. Is that one of the reasons that you think it's a good idea that all of that is known by the apprentice right at the front end, who their endpoint assessment organisation is, and indeed what they've got to do?
I think I'm going to put myself I'm going to just take myself back to when I was an apprentice, which was during the 1990s. It was a long time ago, during the old modern apprenticeships and frameworks. As an apprentice, and I'm sure Holly would probably agree with me, if you know you have to sit assessments, I want to know as soon as possible, one, what those assessments are, what do they look like, what do they entail, how will it, how will the assessment be conducted, and what do I need to do to prepare myself for that? When I went to the apprenticeship conference in Birmingham back in March, I was still hearing from employers, because you had employers there, training providers, endpoint assessment organisations. Employers were still complaining that they weren't having enough communication from endpoint assessment organisations or training providers, and things were kind of being left too late. Now, part of that could be that the employer hasn't actually chosen their endpoint assessment organisation early enough. And
so it's the employer that chooses the EPAO, not the apprenticeship provider?
That's correct.
Or can it be both?
The employer, it's their responsibility to choose the endpoint assessment organisation with the support of their training provider. And I think the other thing we're seeing is that training providers may have a preference of what endpoint assessment organisation they prefer to use, or maybe it's because they've used them the longest or from the start, and they may steer an employer towards a certain one, but ultimately it's the employer who chooses the endpoint assessment organisation, and then the training provider comes in and supports.
And Holly, you know, you've been working throughout COVID. I know you've been working on your degree. It's a degree apprentice at the moment that you're on. I would imagine that for some apprentices, I don't even know if you're going to be able to answer this one. It might be just as open to Caroline, but for some apprentices, it's been quite difficult to complete their coursework because
Yeah.
they're either not working or they've been, you know, that well, their work is not happening at the moment because of the COVID restrictions. Have you found that with people that you're working alongside?
Definitely. So there's people on my course who've been furloughed, and I think it affects the coursework less because obviously you're not working, so you have more time, and you can write your coursework generally about anything in our degree. So you can choose different industries if you want to. But for the 20% off the job training, it's been a real like struggle for the university because there's like 6 months where people haven't done that off the job training. So then they have to do probably 80% when they come back in 1 month to make up for the time that's lost. I do think that our training providers being quite flexible with this. So they're saying to the endpoint assessor, look, if we are missing off the job training throughout the times of COVID, you're just going to have to accept that. And, you know, they couldn't have done the training. So
and I think that I've been reading, Caroline, that there has been buys given in certain areas. So the way that you're being assessed in certain apprenticeships has been changed because of COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, so the Institute for Apprenticeships very early on actually did as much as they could do in terms of and working in conjunction with the EQAs, external quality assurers. They've looked at a whole range of the apprenticeship standards and they've put what they've called flexibilities in place. And if you go to the Institute for Apprenticeship website and you select the standards that you want to look at, it very clearly says at the start which ones have those flexibilities, which has been great because actually the Institute didn't want apprentices to be hindered by the whole COVID situation. And they wanted the apprentices to complete their journey as smoothly as possible. So what they've enabled endpoint assessment organisations to do is carry out the assessments remotely. So whereas before we might have seen an independent endpoint assessor go into the workplace, we can now do things remotely, virtually, and one, that's helped the apprentices to progress, to develop and to achieve their qualifications. Two, it actually keeps the whole clogs moving, income moving, both for the employer, for the apprentice, and for the training providers and everybody, all the stakeholders in that journey. It just keeps the clogs moving and it enables the apprentice to achieve their certificate.
So I've been really surprised. I know we've put in place a software that the apprentice will do their exams that can be proctored, i.e. they don't need to be physically in the same room as the invigilator, they can be proctored. I was really surprised with all of the debacle we've had with exams, etc., that nobody thought to proctor exams in schools or A levels, because that's been commonplace in apprenticeship and adult education for quite some time. Do you see it as an advantage that that type of thing has happened at the moment, because the technology's been there for quite some time? I guess there's more and more acceptance of that technology now. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, when I've spoken to software providers, their exams from March went 90% proctoring, so it was a massive flip, and people, because of the need to keep the economy moving and keep everything going, there was a really big need for that, and so people jumped on that wagon to get things proctored and to do remote testing. As for schools not using that, from my own, with my children aren't at the age yet where they sit exams, but I certainly saw one school using virtual methods much more, because my children go to two different schools. I saw one school using virtual methods much more than the other one, which was next to zero. And I think each school was completely independent.
And is that what you found as well, Holly, in the university? Did they go directly to virtual? Have they been assessing through virtual means?
Yeah, so they just went completely virtual, and from September, it's virtual / going into uni. But for the apprenticeships, it's purely virtual, because, for example, me, I have to travel to Sheffield, so there's no point in me going all the way up there for a half day to do virtual.
So do you know when you get to Gateway? When's that period for you?
So I have to have my degree ratified, and that will be by March. So I finish my degree in December, it's ratified by March, and then they have a 6-month period where you complete the endpoint assessment. So that gives you a bit of time to make sure you have everything you need. So March, hopefully.
So
Excellent.
what would you hope to see, Holly, from your endpoint assessment organisation as you creep closer towards your Gateway? What would you like to see from them?
I think it's good communication, especially given the circumstances. You know, if I'm being told it's going to be face to face and then 2 weeks before they say, oh, actually, we're going to do virtual, I think that would put a lot of people under pressure. And I think people do find the whole endpoint assessment quite stressful already. So I think just as much communication in what you need to do, what you need to have achieved, because the last thing you want is to go into the endpoint assessment, talk about this project that you've done, and they're like, well, that's not really that relevant to what you need to achieve. And you're sat there like, what have I done for the last 3 years? Have I, you know? So I think it's knowing exactly what you need to do and communicating it clearly.
So the guides, we've been working really hard on producing guides for both the apprentice, the employer, training provider, and everyone involved. And within our apprentice guides, we've got the whole endpoint assessment journey in there, and it explains every part of the process, broken right down to, like, we need to see these skills on this particular assessment. We need to know you've got this knowledge, so we might do a test. But even our tests, we have mock tests, we also have study guides. Now, from the other endpoint assessment organisations I've spoken to, both face-to-face and over the phone, I can't see anybody else who are producing these study guides for the exams. Other people are doing mock tests and they're quite openly out there on open source, but I haven't found anybody else who are doing study guides like we are. And what I've found as a real challenge is I've tried to talk to a number of training providers to understand some of the material they're using to train the apprentices. For example, if you're talking about project management, well, what model are they using? Because for us, we don't want to give someone an exam and test on a certain way when they've been taught a different way. So it was really crucial for us and for our apprentices that we're going to be endpoint assessing, that we gave them a study guide so they were fully prepared for their exam. And there's absolutely no reason, if they've read that study guide, that they would fail their exam. So I'm really proud that we've put in place those additional materials, which are part of our service. They're no additional cost for our apprentices to help them.
So Kaz, you know, we're looking at the team leader in front of us. Is this, and really, Holly, is this the same type of thing that you're being asked to do? Is a portfolio of evidence, a presentation, a professional discussion, which some areas would call a viva, and then in some cases, I know there's an examination. There isn't on this team leader, it looks. Is that right, Caroline? There's no exam on this one?
The team leader, remember I mentioned about the endpoint assessment plan changing. So apprentices that were registered on the old endpoint assessment plan do still have to sit an exam. This is the other pathway, which is the new endpoint assessment plan where there's no exam.
Yeah. So is it the same sort of test for you, Holly? You know, is it explain to me a project? Because that's the professional discussion where.
My endpoint assessor is the Chartered Management Institute, because I become chartered as part of my endpoint assessment. So it's very similar to this. So I have a big tracker that outlines all the competencies I need to meet throughout the 3 years. And then in my portfolio of evidence, I have to evidence how I've met all of the competencies. And then I'll do a presentation to explain that. And then I also have to do a work-based review. So you have to study something in your workplace, review it, write an essay on it, and then you present it to them as part of the endpoint assessment. And then as part of the discussion, the endpoint assessor will ask me about my certain projects and see whether A, they think I should be chartered, and B, what my grade should be for the endpoint assessment.
So for you, why did you choose to go down the apprenticeship route? What was the reason that you went down the apprenticeship route rather than a non-degree apprentice?
So I kind of fell into it. I actually did go to university to start. So I went to Swansea for 3 months, and I just found I had been to boarding college, so I was slightly more mature than other students, and I had also worked since I was probably 14, 15, and I felt like I had quite a good work ethic, and I just didn't feel that going to uni full time was really maximising my potential. I had probably 10 hours of lectures a week, and the rest, you know, you're in the library sometimes, you're out with your mates, and I just thought, how much is this really helping me progress into my career? And with so many people doing degrees, I thought, how am I better off than anyone else by just doing this degree? So I decided that Swansea wasn't for me and chose to leave, and I was given an opportunity through a friend where I knew that this company, a local company, was setting up a degree apprenticeship. So I just tried my luck. I managed to get onto it. So I kind of fell into it. It wasn't something I was looking for, but it just worked perfectly for me. So I'm really glad I did.
And are you finding that with the other students on the course, or was it a definite decision for some?
So Sheffield Hallam are one of the leading providers for degree apprenticeships in the UK. And when I started, it was only the second time they'd run the course. So where usually a lot of apprenticeships for higher level, you need quite good grades to get into, Sheffield Hallam were really trying to get people on board. So they were contacting local small businesses, like family run size businesses, and asking, are people interested in doing it? So that's how I think basically all of them got onto it. So it's mostly small businesses, family run businesses, where people feel they just need that extra qualification to get them where they need to be. And
see, isn't that really interesting? Because everybody makes the assumption it's only big businesses that are employing apprentices, and your experience is it's the smaller businesses.
There's no big businesses on my course. The Nestle and Morrison's run the same course at Sheffield Hallam, but their cohort is purely Morrison's and purely Nestle.
Yeah.
So I think mine's slightly better because I get a broader experience with speaking to different people who are in other similar size organisations, and you learn a lot from each other.
Absolutely. And Caroline, didn't you say that there's a whole host of additional funding at the moment that employers can ask for in order to help them if they want to bring on an apprentice?
So when you look at the funding that's available, they kind of break it down into different areas. So first of all, I'll just talk about the incentives that are out at the moment. So back in July, you had the Chancellor who announced the plan for jobs. That was 160 billion, I believe it was billion, 160 billion pound plan to get the economy working and moving again. As part of that, apprenticeships play an absolute crucial role in that whole process of getting the economy back up and running. And what they're saying is from the 1st of August to the 31st of January, if you take on an apprentice, and they have to start within that time, the employers are entitled to these incentives. So if you take on an apprentice aged 16 to 24, you'll receive £2,000. And that's per apprentice. So they can take on as many apprentices as they want to, and they get that £2,000 however many times. If they on apprentice aged 25 plus, because don't forget there's no cap on age, again, they will receive an incentive payment, and that's 1,500. And the incentive payments are paid at set times, so that the first payment's paid at 90 days of the apprentice on programme, and then the second one is at the day 365, so at the end of that year.
So encouraging them to stay, I guess, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, when the government have done any kind of incentives, and training providers used to do them as well, they were the kind of milestones that they always worked to. They had to be in learning at that time, which is right. So it's the right thing to do.
So are you saying?
Sorry.
Sorry, you said that there were a couple of incentives. So the first one is this big wodge of cash. Are there other ways? Because I mean, you know, Holly said quite clearly it's small to medium enterprise as well as those that are playing into the levy. So it's not just the larger organisations.
So there are other incentives, and to go into all the nitty gritty, the best way it would be for an employer to go on the .gov website and just put in the search button, employ an apprentice, or if they want to contact me or ELS, we will happily send them the funding guidelines or talk them through how it works and how the funding works, because there are other incentives as well. And there's another £1,000 incentive for different things. But also the government look at employers and the way they fund them in different ways. So you have the small employers, and when it's kind of a waiver, they've tried for a long time to support smaller employers. And when I mean smaller, I mean employers fewer than 50 employees. They will give the apprenticeship program, they will fund it at 100%. So if you have an apprentice who is aged 16 to 18 or 9, I'm just double checking my notes in front of me because the new funding rules came out literally a couple of days ago. So the government will fund 100% of the training costs up to the maximum funding band for the standards for 16 to 18-year-olds and 19 to 24-year-olds who have previously been in care or who have a local authority education, health or care plan. And to be honest, that's not changed for a long time. We've seen that in place for a couple of years because they really are keen, not just for the big employers out there to have apprenticeship schemes, they're really keen on having small employers take them as well. Apprenticeship starts between the 1st of August and the 31st of January. The rate of co-investment. So when I'm talking about non-levy payers, they talk about co-investment. So this is small employers who want to invest in apprenticeships, but the government will heavily fund it as well. So you work together to take on apprentices. And the co-investment rate is currently 5% for small employers, and the government cover the remaining 95%. And so there's lots of different things. You'd need to really check the funding rules against your, for this is for the employers watching, to really understand where your organisation fits into what criteria.
Okay. We're getting to that point where we're almost going to have to wrap up, but let me just ask, some really simple questions. So Holly, would you encourage an apprentice or somebody to become an apprentice? It's been good for you.
100%. I think you need to be a certain type of person. You've got to have work ethic, and you've got to understand that you're going to give up evenings, weekends, holidays, but the experience that you get and being able to put your foot in a door in a business is going to be much more valuable than just taking the normal route, I feel anyway.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful. And Caroline, obviously, endpoint assessment, we are an endpoint assessment organisation, so we're looking forward to speaking to both employers and potentially providers. It could be an employer provider in order to talk to them about becoming an endpoint assessment organisation for them. Ideally, when would we like to be talking to them in the apprentice's journey? At the front, middle, end?
For me, the sooner the better. As soon as they've got apprentices in place, come and speak to us, see how we can support you. Even if they don't decide to choose ELS as their endpoint assessment organisation, if they want to know any information or support where we can help them with the apprenticeship journey, funding, anything at all, we're more than happy to give that support. And they just need to contact us. The sooner the better, purely because an apprentice wants to know what their endpoint assessment looks like. Yeah.
Well, I can't really see any reason from what you've said and government funding being where it is that people wouldn't consider it at least. Guys, really grateful for your time today. Thank you very much. Been really lovely to speak to you. Next week, we've got a completely different change of direction, as is always our want with Coffee and Chat. And we're being joined by a good friend of mine, Monica Jones, who works at the moment in the NHS, and she's here to talk to us about data and the importance of data and how it's driving behaviours within the National Health Service. So I'm hoping it'll be really, really interesting. Looking forward to it personally, because we've been working with the NHS for the last 4 or 5 years and looking at their data. So very interested in what Monica's got to say. She's specifically interested in the cancer journey, but I think that it'll be a general conversation about data. If anybody out there wants to talk to Caroline a little bit more about apprenticeships, Becky, I wonder if you could just click us back to the contact details. Then Caroline's email is available on our webpage. At the moment, our endpoint assessment organisation front page isn't on our web page, but please feel free to click into the web page and go through to contact, and Caroline will come back to you. It's been really great to meet you, Holly and Kaz. I'll see you back in the office in a bit. Speak soon, everybody. Take
Thanks,
care.
Holly.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.